And there's another fascinating story involving Alexander the Great, very reminiscent of his reported interactions with the Scythians, in which they seem to recognize a kinship and quickly turn potential hostility into fruitful alliance and friendship. Quote, Ludger, the rear admiral of Vichard, became my comrade and later my friend. From his diary I got the following history. After we had lived at the Five Waters, Punjab, for 1200 and twice 12 years, in which our marines had explored all possible seas, Alexander the King came with a mighty army, moving downstream along the river towards our villages. No one could resist him, but we sailors living near the coast embarked with all of our portable goods and left. When Alexander learned that a great fleet had fled him, he became furious, swearing he would sacrifice all villages to the flames if we did not come back. Vichard lay ill in bed. When Alexander heard that, he waited until he got better, then he came to him, speaking most kindly, although he made threats just as before. Vichard answered, O greatest of all kings, we sailors go everywhere. We have heard of your great deeds, so we highly respect your weapons and even more your intellect. But we are different. We are free-born, born of Freya. We can never be slaves. Even if I were to submit, the others would rather die, for that is our eternal law. Alexander replied, I will neither take your land nor enslave your folk. All I want is to hire your services. I swear by our mutual gods that none will complain about me. When Alexander later shared bread and salt with him, Vichard chose the wisest option. He had his son retrieve the ships. End quote. Ptolemy's history claimed that the ships marshaled by Alexander totaled about 2,000, and, quote, the sound of the simultaneous rowing by so many ships was like nothing else, end quote, with the coxswain shouting the in and out for every stroke. The riverbanks, often higher than the ships, funneled and amplified the noise, sending it reverberating from bank to bank, and here and there wooded hollows on either side acted as echo chambers. This must have been impressive to behold. From other ancient historians' accounts, it's reported that when Alexander sails into Sambagre, his ships so impressed those watching from the coast that they believed the army to be gods and submitted immediately. Though the portrayal of Alexander in the work isn't entirely positive. Towards the end of his life, the Oralinda claims, quote, Ralda deserted his soul, and in his arrogance he drowned himself in wine, end quote. And then, quote, after his death, the empire was divided by his princes. They all were to guard a part of it for his sons, but they broke their oaths, and each of them wanted to keep and even increase his part. War broke out, and we could not return. Nearchus now wanted us to settle on the Phoenician coast, but none of us wanted that. We said we would rather risk going to Friesland. Then he brought us to the new harbor of Athena, where to all true Fria's children used to migrate. From there, we shipped mercenaries, food supplies, and weapons, end quote. Thus sparked a return journey, much like the later Goths, back to Europe, according to the OLB. And this accords with the 17th century chronicle by Martinus Hamconius, who began his King's List with a Friso, who had allegedly migrated from India during the time of Alexander the Great. There are several references to brother and cousin peoples within Europe throughout the OLB. It tells the story of a figure named Celta and her followers creating something of a breakaway community, speaks of the British Isles initially being populated with the criminals and the shunned, and seems to speak directly about the Scots as well as the Gauls. It also speaks to a seemingly closely related people they call the Ira, which may have an etymological connection to the Irish, though this is highly speculative, and almost certainly to Iran. And some of the noted customs and beliefs seem very similar to those of the ancient Zoroastrian element. Quote, the Ira are not ireful, but good people, who do not tolerate or worship statues of gods. They also will not permit temples or priests, and just like us, they uphold the sacred light of Vesta, and also maintain permanent fires in their houses." End quote. The OLB speaks to several people groups, the Ira included here, that fled the rule of a corrupt priest class, much like the Frians themselves were spurred to do more than once. And bear in mind, this portion of the story, and a great portion of the overall work, takes place well beyond the more modern and recent home of the Frian people, the approximate territory we today call Friesland. They speak to living in or around, and frequent and profoundly important interactions within Greece and India, and everything in between. If anything about this portion of the work sounds implausible, I'd encourage you to dig deeper. The deeper I dive into that relevant context authored by those earliest and most trusted historians, the more I see evidence of an immense amount of migration and back and forth interconnectedness between Europe into the Black Sea region, following the major river systems, and into India, Persia, and even the Middle East. I'd ask all listening to consider that, as individuals of European descent, our connection with the events recounted by Homer, or those of India and Persia, even Egypt and Sumer, is likely much more profound and extensive than virtually any well-known historian or thinker has publicly theorized, at least since approximately the end of World War II, in which the academic landscape shifted so violently. A man named Lawrence Austin Waddell wrote a series of explosive books in which he claimed that the king's lists in Egypt, Sumer, and India, among others, seemed to be referring to the same individuals, with similar lengths of their reigns over similar periods of time, to the extent that he felt this was beyond coincidence, and that this must have been something of a singular empire at one point, even if it was in the beginning stages of a complete fracture around the time in which more extensive histories began to be written. If science were able to chart its own natural course on this front, I think we'd have uncovered a treasure trove by this point in time. And with the aid of technology and significant effort, a wealth of outstanding questions would likely be definitively answered. Though, as it stands, research and discovery on all these fronts couldn't possibly be more hamstrung or tightly controlled. And it seems to be channeled, purposefully, down paths of extreme omission. However, not all such information can be swept under the rug so easily. At least, not before elements slip out into public view. Studies carried out by scientists from the Institute of Forensic Genetics at the University of Copenhagen have concluded that all individuals with blue eyes share a common ancestor, someone who lived 6,000 to 10,000 years ago near the area by the Black Sea. And this is the period of time and the region in which we first observe an explosion and spread of a people group most similar in physical appearance, spiritual practice, customs and traditions, and general characteristics to the later Arya. And I've come to believe the adventurous and wide-ranging spread of these very peoples led to what we call the Indo-European languages. Might it be that small pockets of this group worked conscientiously to retain their modes of thinking and living throughout the millennia to preserve their way of life, and that one of these subsets kept a surviving historical record? Over the years, as I considered what traits and attributes a surviving core element of this ancient people group might have, assuming they were a powerful and influential people, acting as something of a governing head of a confederacy, I estimated they'd probably have resided in a strategic location, for reasons both military and economic. They'd likely have the best cattle and horses, essentially the most important currency of the day. They may have a greater preponderance of fairer hair or eyes, and almost certainly be a bit taller than the norm. And I long felt they'd likely have a culture and ethos that was stubbornly freedom-oriented, even to the extreme. And again, it's important to state that the Frisians of today certainly aren't a carbon copy of the Frisians of old, and there are raging debates as to just how closely they might be related. But it's interesting to note that their cattle are famed and have since spread across the world, including our own Holstein variety in the US, and are known as the highest production dairy animals. And the Frisian horse is perhaps equally exceptional and well known, and were the type that carried many medieval knights into battle. Also, individuals currently living in the provinces of Friesland and Groningen rank as the tallest people in the world, with the average male height of 1.83 meters and 1.69 meters for women, with some of the highest percentages of fairer hair and eye color. The Netherlands is still very fertile, being the second largest exporter of agricultural goods in the world, and the coastal territory occupied by the Frisian people is of immense strategic value, atop a most important river and at the intersections between the UK, Scandinavia, Germany, and Southern Europe. And the sentence emblazoned on the North Frisian coat of arms, a motto which seems to have become something of a national characteristic and stereotype, is "Better dead than slave." They also continue, to this very day, to make use of the six-spoked Yule or sun wheel, also called the Wheel of Time or Wheel of Fortune. And as previously mentioned, it's strikingly similar to the symbol often referred to as the Flower of Life, ranking alongside the swastika as perhaps the most commonly appearing symbols across the length and breadth of the world throughout history. It also makes sense that a seagoing culture might live at or below sea level, near coastal harbors, and how a significant surprise flood might serve to all but obliterate such people. And this leads us to the mystery of Doggerland, a now submerged region of land that once connected Britain to the continent. The majority of what we know about this mysterious and intriguing landmass has been uncovered not due to historians and archaeologists, eagerly searching for clues to our past, but rather as a sad testament to our age and its orientation by oil companies. It's believed to have supported over 100,000 people at one time in the distant past, and many are now speculating this was once the very heartland of Europe. It's likely that the flooding that conquered this territory happened in more than just a singular event, with the first major event likely being a tsunami, perhaps somewhere around 6000 BC. Its highest point, still visible to this day, was called Heligoland, and was recognized by both the German Kaiser and later Hitler as an extremely important base of naval operations. Something strange occurs after World War II.
This is the German island of Heligoland, the Gibraltar of the North Sea. Once a British possession, Heligoland was the key point of Germany's sea power. In World War II, it was Hitler's base for the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boat pens, gun emplacements, and underground storage tunnels are due to be blown up by thousands of tons of high explosive. They'll be fired by submarine cables and wireless transmission from the Navy ships 9 miles away. At the fourth pip of the BBC time signal, Lieutenant Commander Frank Graves of London pushes the button. "7,000 tons of bombs, depth charges, and high explosives detonate from within the island. A 12,000-foot-high column of smoke goes up. Submarine pens, coast batteries, and 8.5 miles of underground tunnels are blown sky high. It's the biggest man-made explosion since the atom bomb went off at Bikini.
And it wasn't merely obliterated, but was then pummeled with high explosive dropped by bombers with regularity for the next full decade. The entire area of Doggerland is perfectly situated and thus a likely